Onward, a photobiography of an African-American polar explorer, Mathew Hansen, by Dolores Johnson. Essential question: what drives people to explore remote places? In July 1903, Mathew Hansen and Commander Robert F. Peary set sail from New York City in a heavily fortified ship, the Roosevelt, bound for Ellesmere Island in far northern Canada. Over the past 16 years, Hansen and Peary have made 4 attempts to cross the Arctic ice and be the first to reach the North Pole. Hansen has become good friends with the native Inuit who live nearby, but the explorers have been blocked by stretches of open water called leads, especially one called the Big Lead. Now, with a crew of 5, Ross Marvin, Robert Berthold, and newcomers George Burrup, Dr. John Goodsell, and Donald McMillan, the expedition is bringing its sledges or dog sleds to Arctic for another try. The newcomers seem to view the coming adventure as a sporting event. Hansen, who by this time was 42 years old, thought differently. He had devoted practically his whole adult life to the mission. He had teetered close to death. He had lost and nearly lost fellow crew members who had fallen into crevasses or the inky black waters of an Arctic Ocean lead. And he had sacrificed a stable family life so that he could be part of history. This was serious business. Yet Hansen's mood brightened by the time the ship arrived at Etha, Greenland. He was to be reunited with his Inuit friends once again. Much of the warm spirit and decent character that endeared him to many of the people he encountered, such as the Inuit and the people who became his benefactors, is shown in this candid photo of Mathew Hansen. It was shot on the deck of the Roosevelt. The specially built ship, the Roosevelt, contributed to the expedition's eventual success because it got the crew members closer to the North Pole than any previous ship. Here the ship is being unloaded of its cargo. After proceeding so far north, it became trapped in the ice. After Hansen and Peary persuaded the Inuit families to join the expedition, they all sailed to Cape Sheridan in an ice-busting, gut-wrenching voyage that took 2 weeks. Then the men unloaded the ship and sledged the supplies to Cape Columbia, on Ellesmere, which was only 413 miles south of the pole. By February 1909, the entire expedition was prepared to begin the march to pole. The novices had practiced their sledging and hunting and had spent enough time outdoors to prime themselves for the frigid Arctic conditions. Hansen supervised the Inuit women in the preparation and sewing of the garments the crew would wear. Each man had a long red flannel shirt and soft bearskin trousers lined with flannel. The soft cloth absorbed sweat and kept the roughness of the fur away from the skin. The pants were wrapped with a band of bearskin that held the legs snugly. A deerskin coat with a hood covered the torso. Bearskin mittens and sealskin boots completed the wardrobe. The outfit was easily transformed into a fur-lined sleeping sack. Analyze the text. Connotation. The author describes the expedition as an ice-busting, gut-wrenching voyage. Do those words have a positive or negative connotation? How can you tell? On past expeditions, Commander Perry had sent sledges forward to store provisions along the trail, but he realized how unreliable that technique could be if the supplies got buried in deep snow. On this expedition, Perry proposed that a pioneering team would break the trail up ahead. Then 6 relay teams would follow, which carrying enough food, tools, weapons, and clothes for the whole expedition for 5 days. The entire expedition would consume supplies for the equivalent of one of the sledges. When those provisions were gone, one team and the weakest dogs would be sent back to headquarters until the actual participants of the last relay team were sent back. No one but Commander Perry would know who was to accompany him to the pole. Bartelt and Burrap were sent out to break the trail. Then Hansen and his Inuit team were sent out. Marvin, Goodsell, Macmillan, and their teams followed, with Perry trailing. The commander stayed in touch with the units by leaving notes in igloos for retreating teams, so that they could forward information to teams bringing up more supplies. Men paused while driving a sledge pulled by teams of dogs harnessed in a fan formation. The sledge teams had to confront pressure ridges and steep hummocks of ice, tremendous obstacles in their effort to reach the North Pole. Often they had to leave the sledges and dogs to go forward. Stormy weather, blinding snow, and wide expansive leads would often stop onward progress completely. The assault began with difficulty. Between March 2nd and 3rd, the temperature fell so low that no one got much sleep. The men had to beat their arms and feet to keep the blood circulating. The next day, the only way the crews could advance was to use their pickaxes to carve through rough ice studded with pressure ridges and sharp hummocks, or projections of ice. Some sledges broke down, and the drivers often had to prod the dogs forward when they balked. Harsh winds stung their face. Giant fissures in the ice threatened every step. Hansen's party followed Bartle's tracks as far as the big lead. While camped beside the lead, the men woke to the thunderous crack of shifting ice grinding beneath them. At any moment, men, equipment, and dogs could be thrown into the falling water that was passing below. The crews shifted their campsite. Analyze the text, domain and specific vocabulary. The author used technical terms such as pressures, ridges, and sledges. What are the meanings of these words? How can you find out? The team waited 6 days for the ice path spreading across the lead to freeze solid. They then advanced 4 days' marches until they caught up with Bartle, who was stopped again by another wide lead. They had set up camp and wait. On March 11th, a passable lane across the lead finally formed, but steep, rocky ice ridges studded the trail, and their supply of fuel was dwindling. One by one, the supporting parties and their Inuit crews were sent back to base camp to conserve the remaining fuel and supplies. First, Dr. Goodsell was sent back with his team, and then Macmillan. Warrap was sent back on March 20th. The remaining crew crossed plains of deep ice littered with pressure ridges and ice rubble. The temperature rose to 20 degrees below zero. That turned the ice hard and smooth, but the warmer temperature opened up more leads. Robert Perry, an engineer, used his training to reconfigure the design of the Inuit sledge so that it could carry heavier loads and be more durable. Hansen was instrumental in building the sledge that Perry designed and repairing those that disintegrated in the below zero temperatures. Marvin finished 5 marches, and then Bartlett moved up again as the trail breaker. The temperature dropped. On March 26, a disappointed Marvin was ordered back to land. The expedition had gotten past Perry's records of farthest north. Then, on March 30th, Bartlett was told to retreat. Bartlett was so frustrated by not being picked to go all the way to the pole that he walked 5 or 6 miles farther north to reach the 88th parallel, the record up until that date. It was only at Bartlett's departure that Hansen knew he would accompany Perry to the North Pole. The final assault team was made up of Hansen, Perry, and the Inuit Uta, Ukia, Ingua, and Siglu. Hansen, Uta, and Ukia were to break the trail over the last 133 miles. Perry, still crippled by the frostbite that had taken his toes 11 years earlier, took turns riding Ingua's sledge and walking beside it. The conditions varied from stretches of smooth ice to steep ice ridges. Hansen lengthened his marches to a back-breaking 18 to 20 hours a day. Perry caught up to Hansen's team at day's end on April 1st. Analyze the text. Main ideas and details. What is the main idea on page 382 and 303? What details support this idea? On April 5th, Perry checked the position of the sun with his sextant. It told him that the pole was only 35 miles away. The next morning, he alerted Hansen to begin the march. Hansen's progress was so successful that by the time he had covered 20 miles, he was an hour ahead of Perry. As Hansen drove his team across thin ice, bridging a lead, the ice suddenly cracked. Hansen, along with his dogs and sledge, was plunged into the frigid water. Hansen began floundering about, trying to grasp onto jutting ice to save himself. He swallowed frigid water, and his lungs felt like they would burst. Then he found himself being lifted out of the water. It was Uta who saved him and his sledge and dogs. Uta slipped off Hansen's wet boots and warmed his feet, in the Inuit way, against Uta's bare stomach. They continued the march for 4 more hours until Hansen deduced that they must have reached the North Pole. Hansen, who had learned to steer a ship by the stars, had often played a game with Perry that he could estimate their position at the end of marches. Knowing that we had kept on going in practically a straight line, I was sure that we had more than covered the necessary distance to ensure our arrival at the top of the earth, wrote Hansen later. He, Ukia, and Uta built igloos Perry arrived 45 minutes later. When the clouds parted in the sky, he was able to take a latitude sign with his sextant that affirmed they were at 89 degrees 57. The North Pole is at 90 degrees north. They probably got as close to determining their position as their navigational gear allowed. Within 5 miles of the North Pole, for all intents and purposes, the expedition had reached its goal. It was April 6, 1909. In a whisper, Perry announced his reading to Hansen. Then the two explorers, weary with the combination of so many years of effort, crawled into an igloo, lay down, and went to sleep. No other but a Perry party would have attempted to travel in such weather. Our breath was frozen to our hoods of fur and our cheeks and nose frozen. Mathew Hansen. North Pole reached on April 6, 1909, as recorded by Perry and Hansen, Camp Jesup, 89 degrees 57 north. Perry and Mathew Hansen and the four Inuit, Siglu, Engiwa, Ukia, and Uta, posed for the photographs holding the four burners and carried to commemorate their reaching to the North Pole. The Inuit were amazed that the combination of so many years of effort was just another expanse of ice. "There is nothing here," Uta said. When Perry awoke, he wrote in his diary, "The pole at last." He unpacked a thin silk American flag he had been carrying with him all of his many years of exploration and planted it on top of his igloo. Perry, Egingua, and Siglu then sledged several miles beyond the camp, covering a rectangular area to ensure that an inaccurate reading would not spoil their achievement. Perry had Hansen thrust an American flag into a large pressure ridge, and he took a photo of the 5 men holding flags that the commander had carried with him for the occasion. Hansen held an American flag that Josephine Perry had sewn by hand. Ukia held a flag of the Navy League. Uta held a banner from Perry's college fraternity. Siglu waved the flag of the Red Cross, and Igua held the Daughters of the American Revolution peace flag. They all joined an exhilarated chorus of "Hip, hip, hooray!" Then Perry said, "Let us go home, Matt."